Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you all for joining today's webinar titled Food Policy for NCDs Prevention, Lessons from Around the Globe. My name is Haneen Abu Layla and I am the country coordinator for the Jordan Nutrition Innovation Lab based in Jordan. As more attendees are joining, I will begin by going over some of the logistical items. Next, please. Thank you. I would like to direct all attendees to a few functions on this Zoom call. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat icon and a Q&A icon. Please use the chat feature to engage in relevant conversations with the other attendees. Next, please. No, the slide before, please. All right, so I would, if you have a question for our speaker, please use the Q&A feature. We have allocated the final 15 minutes of this webinar for Q&A, at which point our speaker will respond to any questions from the audience. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website following the event. We will repeat these technical housekeeping items in the chat box throughout the webinar as people may be joining in later times. Next, please. All right, so I will introduce our project. The Jordan Nutrition Innovation Lab project is a research and capacity building program that is funded by USAID Jordan under Feed the Future initiative. We pursue research and capacity building activities to support the health and nutrition of women of reproductive age, pregnant, lactating women, and infants and young children in Jordan. Some of our key objectives are implementing a rigorous maternal and child nutrition research agenda, including conducting analysis of existing nationally representative datasets and conducting comprehensive evaluations of programs such as USAID's Community Health and Nutrition Program. Moreover, we build individual and institutional capacity through a word of fellowships, scientific symposia, workshops, and webinars. We conduct these webinars on a regular basis as a means to conduct outreach to a wider stakeholder group in and outside Jordan. This webinar is moderated by Dr. Lynn Osman. I would like now to introduce Dr. Osman. Dr. Lynn Osman is the Saqr bin Muhammad Al-Qasimi Professor in International Nutrition, as well as a professor at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. She has been an active investigator in USAID-funded projects in Malawi, Uganda, Nepal, and most recently in Jordan as part of the Feed the Future Jordan Nutrition Innovation Lab. She has been active in experimental studies with humans on lipoprotein response to several vegetable oils, trans fats, and soy protein, and the glycemic response as modified by various meal components. Most recently, she has been examining the molecular mechanism of action of carotenoids, both provitamin A and non-provitamin A, against several chronic diseases. Dr. Lynn, over to you.
Thank you very much, Haneen. Well, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Lindsay Smith-Taylor, who works at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's a nutritional epidemiologist and director of the UNC Global Food Nutrition Research Program. Her work focuses on designing and evaluating food policies to support healthier, more sustainable, and more equitable diets across the globe. She has worked on a variety of policies, including sugary drinks and ultra-processed food taxes, food marketing restrictions, healthy food incentives, school foods, and front-of-package food labels. On the environmental side, her work has focused primarily on reducing red meat and preventing food waste. Dr. Taylor's food policy work has been featured in many major news outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and The Guardian. And now over to Dr. Taylor.
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here with you today. Thanks so much for having me to share a little bit about what we have learned with regards to healthy food policy for non-communicable disease prevention. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of our work globally, and then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do the science to inform these policies. So why are we doing this? I mean, the reality is that poor nutrition is a top risk factor for global non-communicable diseases, and increasingly we're seeing this in low and middle income countries, and that this change is really being driven by rapid increases in the way we're eating, specifically sugary drinks and ultra-processed foods that are high in nutrients of concern like calories, added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium. And in our lab, we really believe that this is the result of a food environment problem. So when we think about the environment that consumers have to make choices, we're looking at things like food prices and the fact that unhealthy foods are often cheaper than healthy foods. The fact that a lot of these unhealthy foods are really heavily marketed and specifically marketed to children. We're also very concerned about confusing food labeling. So this idea that many products carry a nutrition or health claim, even though the overall product might not be healthy. And we know from a large body of experimental evidence that this causes people to think that a product is healthier than it is. And then lastly, we think about, well, what are the institutions that we're going to school, where we're working, our hospitals, what kinds of foods are they serving people? In many places around the world, a lot of those foods are unhealthy too. And so coming from that food environment problem perspective, our goal is really to use food policy to change these food environments and create healthier diets. So this is a snapshot of the 4 major areas where I work. And today I'm going to focus a lot on food labeling and food marketing, but I'll touch as well on taxes and school foods to give you a little bit of idea about what kinds of policies different countries are innovating with. So why do we need front of package labeling policies? Well, we know that people, first of all, in many countries, nutrition information is not mandatory to be displayed on the package. So consumers may not have any information. And even when they do, we know that consumers don't use these labels very much. They are confusing, they're full of numbers, they have long ingredients lists. And also nutrition claims on the front of the pack are widespread and confusing. So the idea behind front of package labeling policies is to make this nutrition information quicker and more accessible. And some of you may have seen that the World Health Organization just came out in the last couple of weeks with draft guidance recommending front of package labels as an important policy option. So this is a map of the front of package labels that exist around the world, specifically those that are mandatory. So these are required by governments. And this is really important because we know that when these types of labels are not mandatory, that companies will selectively apply them only in situations that benefit the company. So these are countries that require these types of labels. And what you'll notice is that the left half of the map in the Americas is really covered by a specific type of label, which is a nutrient warning label. And this is a stop sign shaped label that tells a consumer if a product is high in a nutrient of concern. This almost always includes sugar, sodium, and saturated fat. Sometimes it includes calories, sometimes it includes trans fat, sometimes it includes non-sugar sweetener. And in our research, both in the field and in experiments, we found that these labels are uniquely well equipped to lead to behavior change because they grab people's attention. They stand out from the package. They get people to look at them. People understand them. We know that kids, people with low education levels, even people without language literacy in a particular language are able to understand the meaning of this language, of these labels. They increase people's perception of risk. So they know that the product is unhealthy, and then that leads to behavioral change. So wanting to shift away from products with these labels to products without. So on the marketing side, why do we need marketing policies? Well, this is because food marketing is incredibly prevalent. It's on TV, it's on movies, it's even in the background in many streaming platforms. Celebrity endorsements. So we just had the Olympics, and there was a big push to get Coca-Cola advertising out of the Olympics, because we know that when celebrities and athletes show a product, that's a very effective way to get consumers to buy it. There's also a lot of marketing on packages, and this leads to something called pester power. When a kid is in a supermarket with their parent, they see a cartoon character or a movie character, and they start asking their parent for this type of product. Increasingly, of course, there's also social media marketing, and this is particularly problematic because it's so targeted to specific types of users. And then we also have games. And again, this is a really prevalent strategy for kids specifically. And we know that the vast majority of marketing that's done is for products that are unhealthy. And then lastly, we also have this type of marketing in schools. So kids are getting this marketing inside their schools, around their schools, even in sports stadiums where they're playing soccer or football or what have you. So marketing is really everywhere, and it's very effective. It gets people to like a product, want the product, and then buy and consume a product. Now, the state of marketing regulations globally is much more sparse than it is with front of package labels. So this is a map of countries that have a robust, government-led food marketing policy, and we really see that there's only a few countries that have this. And I'm actually going to talk about one specific example, which is Chile, who really remains kind of the global leader in terms of both front of package labeling policies as well as marketing policies. And in the Chilean case, they also had a school food policy. So I'm going to use this as a bit of a case study to understand what happens when a country implements a package of policies to try to address this problem of an unhealthy food environment. So Chile is a country that has a very high prevalence of obesity, as well as a very high prevalence of unhealthy diets. So Chile was one of the world's top sugary drink consumers. They also consume a lot of ultra-processed foods. And in 2014, the president at the time, who was a pediatrician, decided that she and her administration wanted to address this problem of childhood obesity. And so they decided to implement a set of policies, which included the first ever front of package labeling scheme with these stop sign labels that would tell people if a product was high in sugar, saturated fat, sodium, or calories. And then in addition, they implemented a progressive series of marketing regulations. The first thing they did is they said, okay, any product that carries this warning label cannot be marketed to children. So you see here this package of these breakfast cereal packages with Tony the Tiger on the left. That looks like what a package looked like before the policy. And then on the right, we see that the Tony the Tiger is gone and this product has warning labels. So first, we're taking away, you can't use these strategies that market to children. And then in 2018, they implemented a second regulation, which was, we're removing all advertising from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. for products that have a warning label, regardless of who they're being marketed to. And this was a really important next step, because we know that kids watch children's programs, yes, but they also watch the Olympics, the World Cup, adult programming. In the US, they watch reality show competitions and things like that. And so by expanding this to a marketing restriction based on hours, it was much more comprehensive. So they've got the labeling and marketing regulations, and then they reinforced this in the schools. So in the schools, they cannot promote or sell products with a warning label. So this is really trying to change the environment that kids are exposed to. So today I'm going to talk just about the first phase. The Chilean regulation was implemented in a series of 3 phases with increasingly strict nutritional thresholds. So today I'm just going to talk about the beginning. And here we're really trying to understand the effects from the food environment and the food supply to what kids are getting exposed to. What kinds of food marketing are they seeing? To things like behavioral change. What are they buying? What are they eating? And we're just starting to look at some of the effects on health. Okay, so first up, this is what this policy looks like. When you go to a supermarket in Chile, it is very clear. You'll see the warning labels everywhere. It makes it very easy to quickly pick out what's unhealthy, because you'll see these big black stop signs on the on the food packages. And we'll see that packages that have more nutrients of concern carry more of these warning labels, and thus more of the package is covered by them. So you can see this example here with the cookies in the middle. I've seen cookies that have up to 5 labels, and it's very compelling when you see these types of labels. The other thing about Chile is that they did a really amazing job implementing this policy. So compliance, or products that were supposed to carry the label, 95% of them did carry the label. So this was something that wasn't just passed as a law, but was really executed very well. There were also really marked decreases in child-directed marketing. So we went from having 43%, nearly half of sugary breakfast cereals having marketing to kids before the law, until after the first phase of the law, we got down to 15% of high-end cereals used as child-directed marketing. So you're starting to move towards much plainer packaging, which has the effect of not having that same pester power effect. And also, we noticed that the warning labels are a lot more apparent because we have this plain packaging. Kids' exposure to food marketing also decreased. I'm only showing the first phase here, where we saw about a 50% reduction in kids' exposure to advertising for things like Coca-Cola or junk food. In the second phase of the law, where we had that total daytime ban, that reduction in exposure actually went up to 75%. So this is a really profound change in terms of what kids are getting exposed to day in and day out with regards to food marketing. Now, one of the things that we know with policies in general, labeling policies specifically, is that, the immediate goal of the policy is to put on this label so that consumers will have information, right? It's this idea that consumers have the right to know what's in their food, and that information should be in a form that's very accessible to everybody. But these labeling policies also have a second effect, which is to incentivize the food industry to reformulate. Because the food industry doesn't want people to stop buying their product. And they know that's what's going to happen with the warning label. So they reformulate their product to get under the threshold that would trigger the warning label. And so they're removing sugar and sodium from the food supply. And that's what we saw happen in Chile. So after the first phase of the law, there was a 7% reduction in the percent of products that carry the warning label. And then there were also reductions, particularly in sugar and in salt. And the sugar reductions occurred in the categories that you would think. Beverages were the category with the biggest changes, which makes a lot of sense. We know that beverages know how to get the sugar out, right? They replace it with non-sugar sweetener. But we also saw it in other categories as well. Now, one thing that was really interesting is that we saw that most changes occurred right along the cutoff values. And so what this tells us is those nutrient thresholds that the government sets are really important, because the food industry is only going to cut sugar and sodium and saturated fat just enough to get under those regulation cutoff values so that they don't have to carry the warning label. Okay, and so now when we think about, well, what happened from a behavioral perspective, we saw, oops, backwards there. Okay, so we saw that there were big reductions in sugary drink purchases of about 24%, which is larger than the changes that we've seen in the past with sugary drink tax policies. Oh, sorry, kind of forgot about my animations here. So what we see is that there's kind of an overall 5% drop in sugar. But when we look a little bit more closely, we see that what's happening is that people are shifting from the really unhealthy beverages where they're carrying the warning label to products that don't carry the warning label. So this is exactly what we want to see. People are going to the store and they're either choosing a different beverage, or they're selecting the same beverage, but the company has cut the sugar values in there. And so this is a really nice result. Okay, and so when we looked at this on changes in children's diets, we also saw that there was a reduction in the sugar that kids were actually consuming. So this is really important to look at, because This law was primarily focused on packaged food products, but we know that kids are getting more than just packaged food. They're also getting sugar in the form of foods that their parents are preparing or sugar added to drinks at home. And what we saw here is that there was this downward shift in total daily sugar consumption, and in particular for younger children. So those are the children on the left. And here we can see that there really was this reduction in sugar that happened after these policies were implemented. Of course, we also want to understand, do people understand what these labels mean? And so this was a cohort study that we did that also supplied the dietary results. We talked to moms of these preschoolers, and then we also talked to adolescents, and we asked them, first of all, if they supported this policy. And this policy had very high support. They felt that the Ministry of Health should do this. What happened in Chile was after they had the initial president who implemented this policy, a subsequent president who was more pro-business, let's say, contemplated revoking this policy, but it had such high levels of public support. People really liked this policy that made it impossible for them to get rid of it or weaken it. People also indicated that they understood that the labels meant that a product was healthy, and that more labels meant that a product was more unhealthy than one label. So this is where the simplicity of the warning label becomes really clear. When we put on a bunch of numbers, the guideline daily allowance label, for example, where you're just taking the numbers from the back and putting them on the front, people don't understand that, and it can sometimes provide conflicting information. But with the warning labels, all they have to do is look at a glance and count the number of labels, and they can see, oh, this product has 3 or 4 labels. That's going to be pretty unhealthy. They don't have to weigh grams of sugar or grams of salt or percent daily value. It's just very transparent. Okay, and so then we did some focus groups with moms, and we asked them how they were using the labels. And we learned some really interesting things. The first is that the labels were really helpful for product categories where there's more confusion, where it might not be as obvious. And this makes sense to us, right? We might know that a dessert is unhealthy or that a soda is unhealthy. But for things like yogurts or cereals, the labels were really useful. So this quote on the left says, "These logos, they help you a lot. Sometimes there are things you wouldn't even imagine had that much sugar. One thing is knowing that it's sweet, and another is knowing how much sugar it has." So the labels are really helping them clarify that these products are high in sugar or sodium, etc. And then this label on the right really speaks to the comprehensive nature of the policy. So this kid is telling, or this mom is saying, "Because of this new law, my daughter has been taught a lot about these black logos. No, mom, you can't buy me that. My teacher won't accept it because it has those labels. And she requests salads. She won't accept snacks that have the black labels." So one thing that was really interesting and that we didn't really realize when we were doing this work is that the kids were going to be teaching the parents, because the kids were learning about it in schools. The teachers were saying, you can't bring these products to school. And then the kids were telling their parents. So this really speaks to the mutually reinforcing nature of these packaged policies. The other thing is that the school food environment became a lot healthier. So the prevalence of foods that were unhealthy dropped from 90% to 15%. And then the foods that kids were actually eating at schools also became healthy with regards to reductions in sugar, saturated fat, and salt for the younger kids, and sugar and saturated fat for the older kids. So one of the major concerns that comes up with these types of policies in almost every country where I've worked is that it's going to have an impact on the economy. So the food industry, when they're lobbying against these type of regulations, will say, oh, this is going to kill us. This is going to put people out of work. So we've looked at this now in both Chile and Peru, which is the second country that implemented these labels. And we found that there has been no effect on the economy as a result. Either in the food industry sector or at large. There are no changes in employment or wages, and no evidence of impact on trade. And anecdotally, if anything, there's some evidence that these types of labels stimulate new business development because there's demand for healthier products. So examples being these fruit pouches or fruit snacks that we saw in Chile. Okay, so what happened over time? This labeling policy was first implemented in 2016. And then we had COVID, and then we had global food price increases, inflation. And so we went back out in the field in 2021 and we talked to moms again. And what we heard from moms this time around was that they were still using the labels. The labels were helpful to them. They understood that they meant that products were unhealthy. But the problem now is that they still couldn't afford to buy the healthier foods. So this is a really important problem to address, right? So now people have a good understanding of what's healthy and what's not, but do they actually have access? Can they actually afford to buy what's healthy? So that was a really important kind of lesson that we learned as part of this evaluation. The second thing relates to other unintended consequences. So one thing that we saw when we caught the food marketing for products that had warning labels is that there was more marketing of products with non-sugar sweetener, right? So here on the left, you see a child holding a Coca-Cola without sugar. So they're allowed to use children in their advertisement so long as it doesn't exceed those thresholds. And so that's what they did. They reformulated their products, and now they're still using kids in their advertising and still targeting these products to kids. And so that really speaks to the way that the industry is able to identify loopholes and exploit them. So the original Chilean law did not say anything about, didn't cover all food marketing for kids. Even though these non-sugary drinks are still ultra processed, they're still not recommended for kids. Because the law didn't include those, the industry figured out a way to continue their marketing in this particular way. And then on the right, what we see is the strategies that the food industry is using to try to distract from the label. So next to those black stop signs, what you'll see is some labeling that's essentially telling you, oh, well, this has warning labels for 100 grams, but if you only eat 30 grams of product, it only has this much sugar. And so this is the food industry's attempt to try to use different labels to distract from the regulated label. And we've actually seen this now in a few different countries. It looks a little different everywhere, but there's this kind of common pattern that we see that even though they are mandated to carry these warning labels, the companies will introduce other marketing elements to try to distract or cover up from these mandatory labels. And then the other thing that happened in Chile was that we saw this increase in non-nutritive sweeteners. If you recall, I said that beverages had the biggest drop in sugar. And what happened was that they replaced that with non-sugar sweetener. So that increase, the prevalence increase in the food supply from 38% to 47%, purchases of non-sugar sweetener went up, and preschoolers' intake went up as well. Now, non-sugar sweeteners were already very widely consumed in Chile. They have a long history of them being recommended for use by physicians and nutritionists. So some of this was, a bit of a historical context for why this is so high. But clearly what we saw is that when the companies are reducing their sugar specifically, they're replacing that with non-sugar sweetener. And because non-sugar sweeteners are not recommended for consumption in kids, this is something that is problematic. Now, what's happened since the Chilean policy was the first, is that now we're seeing more and more countries, when they introduce these types of policies, including a warning label on non-sugar sweeteners as well. So an example, Colombia is the most recent country to implement this type of warning label system, and they have a warning label for sugar, a stop sign that says high in sugar, and then they also have a warning label for non-sugar sweeteners that says contains non-sugar sweeteners, so that there isn't this kind of trade-off. It doesn't provide the same incentive for the food industry to reformulate sugar by substituting non-sugar sweetener. Okay, so what do we take away from the Chilean policies? On the whole, we saw that they worked. They reduced nutrients of concern in the food supply. They reduced consumers' purchases of these nutrients of concern. They reduced consumers' purchases of the most unhealthy foods. We saw that children and adults understand the warnings. We looked at, in our purchase data, we looked at households with different education levels, different socioeconomic status, and we saw that the policy really worked equally well for everybody, which is really promising. You don't want to see a policy that only works for people with high levels of education or high income. This was a policy that worked well for everybody. But to strengthen the policy, we really need to include additional regulations. So for example, cutting down on some of those labeling strategies that companies like to use. So after Chile, countries like Mexico said, if you carry a warning label, you can't use any nutrition or health claim at all. So we're going to just get rid of those and really get towards a much clearer, simple message on the package. And then again, addressing this non-nutritive or non-sugar sweeteners issue by including a label for that as well. Now, the other thing that we learned from Chile was this issue around prices. So we can't just have these kind of standalone policies that are focused only on disincentivizing unhealthy foods. We really want to think about a package of policies. So in Chile, we saw that it worked well to have the labeling and marketing and school policies, but an important addition to this would have been making sure that people, especially people with low income, could afford healthier options. So as a result of this, in Chile, we're now working with the Chilean researchers who led this study, who are in touch with the Chilean government, who's interested in designing a healthy food incentive program that would provide financial assistance to low-income families to buy healthy foods at farmers markets. So buy produce, buy plain meat, plain cheese, eggs, and fish, to make sure that people can not only just know what's unhealthy, that they can also afford to buy what's healthy. So shifting away from the focus on Chile and just touching upon some of the other important food policies that are being implemented around the globe, I would say another really critical one are the dietary guidelines. In many countries, the dietary guidelines serve as the underpinning to federal food policy. And in recent years, we've seen more and more emphasis on more of a holistic approach. So in the US, where I am located, it's really about nutrients and food groups. But in other countries, we're starting to see more of an acknowledgement of environmental sustainability, recognizing that we need a sustainable food environment, our food system, in order to produce these foods. So for example, guidelines that say things like eat less beef and processed meats. That's a recommendation that has benefits for health and benefits for the environment. Another important component to this is around ultra-processed foods, and that would be a whole different webinar to get into the science about ultra-processed foods. But when we think about foods that are factory produced, tend to contain additives, often are the ones that are high in sugar, high in sodium, high in saturated fat. We're seeing guidelines now that are recommending that people avoid these ultra-processed foods as well. And then the last piece of this is really relates to the social components, wanting to preserve these traditional ways of eating. So enjoying meals with family and friends, not eating meals on the go or in front of a computer, but really taking time to eat. So these are some of the things that we're seeing with regards to dietary guideline policies. In terms of school policies, so I would say Brazil is a leader in terms of global dietary guidelines. They have these very similar policy guideline recommendations there, but they're also the world's leader in school food policy. So in Brazil, 75% of the food that is procured must come from natural or minimally processed foods. So they're really ensuring that the food, like you see in these pictures, are things that are fresh, that are prepared, they're not coming out of packages. And 30% of those foods have to come from local family farmers. And so this is really a policy that is designed to promote health, and it's also designed to promote sustainability. So protecting the local farming infrastructure and making sure that there's consistent demand for these farmers to be able to continue to produce. So our colleagues in Brazil are currently leading an evaluation to understand the nutritional impacts of a policy like this. Now, I touched upon on the need to make sure healthy foods are affordable. Another really common policy approach are fiscal policies on sugary drinks, right? So these are sugary drinks taxes. These have all been implemented since 2014. Mexico is the first country to implement a national sugary drinks tax. Now we see that there are more than 60 countries across the globe that have taxes on sugary drinks. Many countries implement this policy because they have a budget deficit and they need revenue. But what we see in pretty much all of the countries where a sizable sugary drinks tax has been implemented is that these taxes do lead to reductions in sugary drinks, which is really important for health since we know that sugary drinks are a leading contributor to dental caries, weight gain, and cardiometabolic risk. And in the last couple of years, we've started to see more emerging evidence on the actual health impact. So reductions in hospital admissions for dental caries, reductions in body mass index, and so some really promising evidence that these policies are effective for health. Now, we've seen similar policies on unhealthy foods or ultra-processed foods, but much fewer. And the one that I want to call to your attention is Colombia. Colombia, just in the past year, implemented probably the world's strongest tax on ultra-processed foods. And this is a tax that's going to increase up to 20% by 2025 on foods that are high in sodium, saturated fat, and sugars. And so this is a really strong tax that's going to cover, I think, about 50% of the packaged food supply. And at the same time, they have these warning label policies. So this is another example of a country that's really trying to take a comprehensive approach to letting people know what foods are unhealthy, and then trying to address this issue around the disproportionate availability and affordability of these unhealthy foods. And then, as I mentioned before, of course, it's really important to couple these types of programs with healthy food incentive programs. The ideal policy package would probably have both, right? So we would make sure that people know what products are unhealthy that have the warning labels. Those products might be taxed, and then that revenue could be used to fund healthy food incentive programs like the one that's being developed in Chile. So again, making sure that that money is going to support the purchasing of healthy foods, particularly among low-income families whose budgets are affected the most. So that's kind of my global tour of food policy evaluation and what we know and where we're at globally. What do we do when we're in a case like, I know from having spoken with the Jordanian Ministry of Health and some colleagues there, where we're just starting to think about how do we design these types of policies? When we're thinking about non-communicable disease prevention, what's the starting place for making sure that we're introducing a policy that is evidence-based and is also appropriate for the context of a particular country? So this is the kind of model that we've used in many of the countries where we work. We're always partnering with local researchers, oftentimes the Ministry of Health or others. And the first step to this is really understanding the food supply. So collecting nutrition data on products that are already on the market. We usually do this by going into grocery stores and snapping photographs and determining the prevalence of foods that are high in calories, sugar, sodium, saturated fat, potentially looking at the prevalence of non-sugar sweeteners, looking at the prevalence of ultra-processed food, and then also, ideally, if we have the data, if we have nutrition, dietary intake data, or other types of data like sales data, understanding what people are eating and who's eating what, right? So we might have different parts of the country that are eating different types of food, or eating different nutrients. And so really getting that baseline understanding of when we think about NCDs, what types of foods are really driving that problem in a particular place. And then the next step of this is really about evaluating food labeling and marketing. So what actually exists? So using that same information that we collected from a grocery store, we'll go and we'll analyze what's on food packages. So what is the prevalence of nutrition claims or health claims? So here we've got a Cheerios example where we see multiple different health and nutrition claims on it. That's really important for a labeling policy so that we can go and say, hey, the prevalence of nutrition claims is very high, and these claims are appearing on products that are high in sugar or high in sodium or products that are unhealthy. And that really provides evidence to support a ban on these types of claims. We can also use this data to look at child-directed marketing. We also use sometimes data from television commercials or from online platforms to understand, okay, well, what types of techniques are being used and who are they targeting? And that can inform a marketing regulation. So for example, we want to ban the use of child-directed marketing techniques to children under 18. The next step of this that's really, really important is establishing a nutrient profile model. And this really applies to almost any policy that I've talked about today. And it really asks the question, what foods would be affected, right? So what products would get a warning label, what products would be subject to getting banned from marketing, what products could be sold in school. And to do that, you have to set a nutrient profile model that indicates which products are eligible versus ineligible. And this is a really important and sometimes challenging task because you're looking at the distribution of the nutrients in the food supply, what people are eating, what the recommendations are. And you also want to be mindful of capturing the products that are unhealthy, but not necessarily making a nutrient profile model that's too strong, or else you might get the entire food supply and then people won't have choices. So there's a lot of research that has to be done to figure out what's the right threshold for a particular country. And then next, when we're thinking about, this goes more into kind of labeling, but this is where we think about, okay, now we have all this evidence on front of package labels from around the globe, but what's going to work to communicate to this particular group of consumers? And we might think about a particular country. What languages are there? I've done some work in South Africa where they have 11 official languages. And so that means that we need a label that's going to be able to communicate across languages. The visual elements are really going to be important. What kind of shape can we use to communicate warning? What kind of color is most effective? What kind of text is most effective? You know, we're going to have some text on there. Can we use language that resonates with the most people? So that's usually a piece of this. And then we'll go in and start doing consumer testing, getting feedback from people, understanding what works. And then moving into the field and actually doing objective experimental testing. The reason why we do this in multiple stages is because sometimes what people tell you they think they want doesn't end up working well when it's actually on a package. So for example, oftentimes when we're doing focus group testing, people will tell us that they really like a red label. They think the red label is really effective at signaling kind of like a warning or danger, or this product is high in. But then when we go out in the field and we're objectively testing it on a product, you can see here from these juice drinks that I'm showing, a red label often blends in, right? Because the products are colorful, the product itself might be colorful, the label might be colorful, and so the red labels tend not to work. But we often have to go through kind of multiple stages of testing and making sure we're really coming out with the strong evidence that policymakers need to be able to move forward with a particular policy design. So here's an example from a study that I recently did in Indonesia, where we were looking in adolescents and we were testing a warning label, which you see on the top, a traffic light label, which you see on the lower left side, and then a healthy check label. And what the adolescents told us is that they really like this traffic light label, right? They thought it was friendly. They thought it was colorful. They felt that it was more informative and scientific because it has all these numbers on it. Right? So it seems on its face like this would be the one that would be the most informative, the one that would be most helpful. But when we went in and we actually tested them in an experimental setting, what we found is that the warning labels and the traffic light labels both help consumers identify products, but only the warning labels were actually effective at influencing food choices. And the reason for this is that, as you can see here on the traffic light label, it can be a little bit confusing. So we've done these kinds of experiments in multiple countries. And what we found is that people will say, well, now I'm actually not sure because on one hand, you're telling me these two nutrients are red, but you're telling me these nutrients are yellow. Sometimes you'll have a green nutrient, which means that it's healthy on that nutrient. And so it's very conflicting and confusing, which is why the warning labels tend to perform better when we actually do these experiments. And so just to kind of wrap up, this is my last slide. You know, I really think, you know, one take-home message from today is that it's really a package of food policies that is the most effective in terms of changing the food supply, helping consumers make healthier choices, and preventing NCDs. Food labeling policies are often the starting place as a foundation because we have a nutrient profile model that tells us what's unhealthy. We then have a labeling system that will serve as a visual signal to consumers in the food industry about what's unhealthy. And then we can layer on these additional policies that can help us target these different factors that affect consumer choice. So things like marketing, school foods availability, and prices. So I will stop there, and before I open up for questions, just acknowledge my amazing collaborators, particularly at the University of Chile, who really were the driving force behind this evaluation of the Chilean policy, as well as my colleagues at the Global Food Research Program as well as our funders, which you see on the left. So thank you so much.
Wow. Dr. Taylor, that was absolutely fantastic. Well, of course, we do have questions. And from one of our colleagues, Sanalain Kamani, she's wondering how Chile deals with labeling of imported foods. Are the imported foods also mandated to have the same warning labels? And how do they engage the food companies outside of their countries to comply?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is surprisingly simple. They put a sticker on them once they arrive into the country. So there's little black warning label stickers. And if you go like in the Chilean airport, you'll see this where they bring in American M&Ms, and the M&Ms have a, the cartoon M&M candy guy. And so they'll put the black warning label sticker over the cartoon person. So they're able to get that warning label on there and then also kind of block the child-directed marketing.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yanlin Ren is wondering if the pre-post slides where there was a 5% difference, or where there was a difference, was that statistically different?
Yes.
It was. Okay. And he had another question. Are the results on perception of labels nationally representative?
From the slides that I showed, no, those are not nationally representative. Those are from 2 cohorts that we've done in moms and then in adolescents. I believe that there is a international food policy survey that's done by Dave Hammond up in Canada. I'm not sure if that's nationally representative. I'd have to check, but that survey includes thousands of people and found similar results.
All right. We have another question here from Sanalain Kamani, who I believe is now working in Thailand. Appreciating the nutrient profile models need to be tailored to the country. What experience do you have with adapting existing models, for example, in geographically similar countries? Do you have to start from scratch in each country?
That's a great question. And I think that adapting previous models makes sense, is a really logical starting place because they've already done a lot of that homework. So for example, WHO CIRO has a model for Southeast Asia that I believe sets high-end nutrient thresholds, but doesn't have the, if you were to do a traffic light label, it doesn't have the lower thresholds, but it does have those initial high-end thresholds. So you could start there, and probably the next step would be to actually apply it. Often what we'll do is we'll take 3 or 4 existing nutrient profile models. So we'll take the one for the region, and then we'll take ones from other regions, and we'll apply it to a food supply, and we'll see what that coverage looks like. So for example, you might see that under the WHO CIRO model, you get 70% of the products are going to have this label versus the Chilean model, only 50% will. And so using kind of these other nutrient profile models can help you triangulate and figure out what might be the right starting place for a particular country.
Okay, thank you. A question from Joe Akra. What is the role of technology in the process of implementing health safe policy countries level? And how are countries like the USA with more advanced tech system still have major health issues among the population?
I don't know the answer to that question. I assume that it relates to reformulation. Is that what is meant by technology?
Or there's different ways to process. I don't know I can't interpret the question.
That's an interesting question, and one that is kind of controversial or debatable in the field, I would say, because on one hand, you have these companies that are reformulating. They're cutting the sugar, they're cutting the sodium and replacing it with potassium salt or something like that. But the food products are still considered ultra processed. And so there's this big question of if we can get people to switch from Coca-Cola to diet soda, how effective will that be for our health versus if we were able to get them to water? So I tend to think of it as a harm reduction model where it is really valuable to at least get people to move towards lower, sugar, sodium, and saturated fat intake, lower energy density, but it's still probably not as helpful as getting to the healthiest option, which would be plain water. And so as we see these policies being implemented around the world and we see companies reformulating, that's going to be kind of like the next big question that we need to address in our evaluation is reformulation. Can food technology really save us here, right? Can we reformulate our way out of obesity and diabetes? And I am skeptical that we can, but it kind of remains to be seen. I would say it's still an open question.
All right, thank you. I have a question that in the Institute of Food Technology that I belong to, there's a discussion about the difference between technological processing of foods, like milk is pasteurized, versus food formulation. And often the literature is conflated. Anything that's ultra-processed is bad. How does that affect your work at all, or have you been able to steer clear of getting involved with putting everything into one bucket?
So the NOVA food classification system for ultra processing is pretty clear on that. So products like milk would never be considered ultra processed unless they contained additional additives, added sugar. If you're buying Milo, which is a powdered milk drink that's very popular all over the world, that's going to be ultra processed. That's a formulation. But if you're getting fresh milk that doesn't have anything added to it, yes, it's gone through processing, it's gone through pasteurization, but that's considered different conceptually than something that would be ultra processed. So there is a lot of, we actually have Kevin Hall visiting us tomorrow here at UNC, who's kind of the pioneer in terms of getting to the heart of some of these questions. These questions around what is it about ultra processing that is so bad? And I don't think we know right now. We don't know, is it something about the actual processes? Is it actually just about the ingredients? Is it about a specific type of additive or colorant? Or is it really just about sugar, salt, fat, and calories? And that model wouldn't be so different from where we've been in the past. Is it something about the food matrix? Is it about the fact that if you took, someone used the example the other day of those, I don't know if you all are familiar with these peanut puffs, where they take peanuts and they mix them with corn powder and then they puff them back up, and you eat that versus eating a whole peanut. Those are going to be absorbed very differently by your body. And so is it something about digestion? I think those are all really important questions that we need to be answering.
Yep, I think you're right about that. All right, I took a note back when you started, you mentioned about no advertisements on the TV between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Do you have any idea if that would work in the US? I can imagine the industry, the lobby would be so big, it would never pass. What do you think?
Yes, I think that it would be, I don't think it would happen in the US. Now, there was a bill that was introduced in the Senate in April that did call for restricting the use of child-directed techniques, which would be following from tobacco, right? So there is a history in tobacco in the US, which has some of the strongest protections for corporate speech in the world. There is a history in tobacco that you cannot market tobacco products to kids. And so the argument for food, I think, would be similar. I think it's probably the strongest for sugary drinks because there's really no nutritional benefit to sugary drinks. And so you could say, all right, we don't think that this product should be able to be marketed to this vulnerable population. I don't think we would ever get to a place where we would have a watershed ban on food marketing like what Chile has.
Okay. Two more questions have just shown up from Shatabdi Goon. When discussing the combination of models from regional and other countries to analyze the food supply, she's curious about the specific individuals involved in the process. Will there be representatives from both regional and national levels, such as researchers and policymakers?
Yeah, typically the way that it works is that you have, researchers in a particular country that are doing this, oftentimes with the involvement of researchers from other countries or from national or international NGOs. It's really important to engage with multiple stakeholders. So I think the ideal model is that you have an independent group of researchers that are doing this and can bring a scientific lens. They're not being influenced by external forces, but that they are talking to different people, right? They're talking to the policymakers, they're talking to all sorts of different stakeholders to try to develop this. And so a lot of times the request will come from the Ministry of Health or another governmental body, and then it's being done by a group of scientists.
All right, thank you. From Cassie Van Etten, thank you so much for your presentation. You gave an example of how children were influencing their parents' food purchases based on what they learned in school. Was nutrition education changed on a large scale or just by the individual teachers?
That's a great question. To my knowledge, I don't know about any kind of national mass education effort that was done in Chile. In fact, it was a really interesting thing that we talked about, which was that they didn't really do, they didn't have an educational campaign. I don't believe that they introduced a particular type of nutrition programming inside the school, but what they did do very well is that they were very compliant. And so my sense, as far as I know, is that teachers, like individual teachers, were telling their class, you can't have this in school. And that's how children learned about it.
Okay. Gosh, we only have 3 minutes. Okay. Given the significant influence of social media on dietary choices, what are some strategies to leverage these platforms to promote healthier eating labels or habits and challenge misinformation about the nutrition?
Yeah, so social media and digital media in general represents kind of the next forefront in this space. That's been very difficult to crack, both from a regulatory perspective and from a, well, can we use this to our advantage perspective? And I'll speak about the first one, which is, there was just Australia just last week said that they were going to ban, I think, social media for kids under 14 or something like that. But it becomes really, really difficult to do because kids use their parents' devices. Who's actually going to monitor compliance with this type of policy? Similarly, it's a lot harder to kind of crack down on companies advertising to kids because it's super personalized and you don't really know who's on that receiving end of that device. So there are great researchers who are working on this question of even just measuring what kids are exposed to. On the flip side, how can we actually use this to our advantage in public health to promote healthy eating? I think that the challenge there is that public health doesn't have access to the level of funding and research and technology that the food companies have. So we're over here kind of in the dark ages still plodding along with some very basic health promotion campaigns, and they're in there with influencers and hyper-targeted advertisements that are eliciting engagement, getting kids to send ads to their friends. So I think probably the best thing to do would be to recruit some influencers who would be open to promoting this and using that as a potential strategy.
Okay, we have 1 minute. A quick answer too. Was there a political will to get the policies in Chile in place? And you mentioned the president was a health professional. Where there isn't a health professional as the president, what do you think are the best ways to engage the policymakers?
So Chile was a unique example because of the dictatorship. There's really not a civil society in Chile. There wasn't a strong coalition. And this was really something that was done with a strong Ministry of Health and a strong president and a great group of researchers at the University of Chile. They're kind of the exception to the rule, right? They were able to do this without having strong civil society. In the other countries where I've worked, it's really about having a strong coalition comprised of health professionals, scientists, parents' rights organizations, consumer right organizations that are really able to make a strong case that we need to do this and kind of fight back against the food lobby. Also in Chile, the food companies weren't wise to this yet. They were the first. And now the food companies, they're transnational. They know this is coming. They put up much stronger of a fight. And so it's really about having that coalition that addresses kind of the policy side, the science side, the mass media public support side. That's really the most effective.
Okay, well, I think we're completely out of time. I know that some of our colleagues from Jordan are online at the moment, and they're looking forward to what can be done in Jordan. You mentioned you might be involved, so I think that's it. Thank you so much for being able to present today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.